A young girl was sitting quietly in her seat, staring out the airplane window as the clouds drifted by like soft cotton fields floating in the sky. She had always loved flying because it made her feel weightless, free, and full of wonder. The soft hum of the engines was soothing, almost like a lullaby blending with the gentle chatter of passengers. Everything felt peaceful, routine, and perfectly normal, until it wasn't. Without warning, a loud, violent jolt shook the entire aircraft, throwing cups, phones, and magazines into the aisle. The lights flickered, overhead compartments burst open, and terrified screams filled the cabin. The young girl froze as her heartbeat thundered in her chest. A second, even stronger shudder tore through the plane, and the calm hum of the engines suddenly faded into a sickening silence. She could hear the wind whipping violently against the metal frame, a sound that didn't belong on a peaceful flight. Passengers began shouting, crying, and calling out for help. Flight attendants rushed to control the chaos, but even they couldn't hide the terror in their eyes. Something was terribly wrong, everyone knew it. The girl glanced out the window again and saw smoke trailing from one of the engines. The once powerful turbine, the heart of the jet, was now lifeless. The plane was no longer cruising, it was falling. Not straight down, but dipping forward, losing altitude fast enough for her stomach to twist painfully. People clung to their armrests, some whispering prayers, others crying uncontrollably. You could feel the fear spreading like wildfire, jumping from one heart to another. The cabin, which had been filled with soft conversations, was now filled with panic. The young girl felt her hands trembling, but something deep inside her refused to let fear consume her. She took a slow breath, trying to think clearly despite the chaos around her. A flight attendant hurried toward the cockpit, her face pale. She tried opening the door but found no response from inside. She knocked harder, calling out to the pilots, but there was nothing, no voice, no movement, no sound. Something was terribly, unimaginably wrong. After several desperate tries, she turned toward the passengers with eyes full of dread. Her voice shook as she announced something that made the entire cabin fall into a stunned silence. The pilots were unconscious. For a moment, the world felt unreal, like everyone had been dropped into a nightmare. How could both pilots be unconscious? What had happened? There were no answers, only terror. The aircraft continued descending, the pressure inside growing more unstable with each passing second. The horizon outside the windows had tilted, and some passengers could now see the ground coming closer and closer. The young girl's heart pounded, but instead of breaking down, her mind started racing through memories she never expected would matter. She remembered hours spent playing flight simulator games, watching tutorials, and studying how airplanes work simply because she loved aviation. It was a hobby she never took seriously, until now. She didn't know everything, but she knew enough to recognize that without a pilot, the jet was doomed. She unbuckled her seatbelt despite the warnings from screaming passengers telling her to stay seated. The aisle was shaking so violently that walking felt like stepping on a moving earthquake. People clutched at her arm, asking where she was going, begging her not to get hurt. But she kept moving forward, her hair whipping around her face as the plane trembled. When she reached the cockpit door, the flight attendant looked at her with confusion and fear. The girl took a steadying breath and said in a trembling voice that she knew a little about flying airplanes. She didn't claim to be an expert. She didn't pretend she could save everyone. But she was the only one on board who had even the slightest idea of what those controls meant. The flight attendant hesitated, torn between fear and hope. The girl could see the desperation in her eyes, the unspoken plea for a miracle. Finally, the attendant nodded and helped her open the cockpit door. Inside, the sight was even more terrifying. Both pilots were slumped over their controls, unconscious but still breathing. The cockpit alarms were flashing red warnings everywhere. Altitude alerts beeped relentlessly. The control yoke was trembling from turbulence and aerodynamic instability. The sky ahead looked blurred as the plane continued its uncontrolled descent. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move forward. She pushed one of the pilots gently aside and slid into the seat. For the first time in her life, she was inside the cockpit of a real jet, and she had to fly it. Not for fun, not as a game, but to save hundreds of people. Her hands hovered above the controls. Everything inside her screamed that she wasn't ready, that she was just a kid, that this was impossible. But something stronger pushed back, the knowledge that if she didn't try, no one else could. She scanned the panels with wide eyes, trying to remember everything she had learned from simulator videos. She reached for the microphone to call the flight attendants to check the pilot's pulse and confirm they were alive. Meanwhile, she tried stabilizing the plane by pulling the yoke back gently. The aircraft responded sluggishly but enough to reduce the speed of descent. Passengers held onto hope as the sudden steep dive slowly turned into a controlled glide. The shaking didn't stop, but at least the fall wasn't as deadly. Her voice trembled as she pressed the communication button to contact air traffic control. Her message came out shaky and emotional, but she announced the situation as clearly as she could. The pilots were unconscious, the engine had failed, and she needed immediate guidance. The control tower fell silent for a moment, likely stunned that a child was speaking, but soon a calm, steady voice began instructing her step by step. She followed every instruction with intense focus, her hands sweating, her breath shaky. But she did not give up. With every correction she made, the jet slowly stabilized. The pressure alarms quieted slightly. The angle of descent improved. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't crashing anymore. Passengers watched through tear-filled eyes as the girl fought to keep the plane steady. Some whispered prayers, others held their loved ones tightly, and many simply stared forward, unable to believe that their fate rested in the hands of a young girl who had found bravery in the darkest moment of her life. The ground was still approaching, but instead of rushing up dangerously, it was now coming into alignment, slowly, steadily, almost under control. The girl swallowed hard and wiped tears from her cheeks. She wasn't thinking about herself anymore. She was thinking about the elderly man who had helped her store her bag earlier, the mother rocking her crying baby, the couple celebrating their anniversary, the students laughing in the back rows, and every stranger who wanted to live. She thought about how life could change in a single moment. How courage could come from the most unexpected places. And how sometimes, even a child could carry the weight of hundreds of lives on her small shoulders. She kept adjusting the yoke, following instructions, fighting against fear, gravity, and time. The emergency sirens were still blaring, but she didn't let them break her focus. Her eyes stayed locked on the altimeter, the runway guidance, and the horizon. She wasn't just flying a plane anymore. She was fighting for every soul on board. She was becoming a hero. One careful breath, one trembling decision, and one courageous heartbeat at a time. With fear in her eyes but courage in her heart, the girl stepped forward, knowing that nothing about this moment was normal or safe. Her legs felt weak, trembling like thin branches in a storm, but she refused to let them freeze. Every step she took down the narrow aisle felt heavier than the one before it, as if the weight of 186 lives was already pressing down on her shoulders. Passengers turned their heads toward her, some with confusion, others with desperation, all silently hoping she knew more than she looked capable of. She was young, far too young for a responsibility this size, but the situation was bigger than age, bigger than fear, bigger than anything she had ever imagined facing. As she moved forward, the plane continued to shudder violently. The overhead lights flickered erratically, casting brief shadows across terrified faces. The emergency alarms from the cockpit were still echoing through the cabin, each sharp tone a painful reminder that time was slipping away. The aircraft was losing altitude rapidly, and every second counted. The young girl's breath hitched as the floor beneath her vibrated with the sound of a struggling machine fighting against gravity. Her heart felt like it was pounding loud enough for everyone to hear, but she kept going, one determined step at a time. She could remember countless nights sitting in front of her computer, practicing landings on her flight simulator, imagining the thrilling sensation of flying a real airplane someday. She had memorized tutorials, studied control layouts, and practiced takeoffs, landings, and emergency procedures for fun. It had always been a game, a hobby she enjoyed after school, something she never expected would mean anything in the real world. But now, staring down the aisle toward the cockpit, she realized that all those hours spent learning, all those simulated crashes and retries, all those moments when she told herself she could do better, they were suddenly the only things she had to cling to. The flight attendants watched her approach the cockpit door with expressions torn between fear and fragile hope. One of them, shaking from panic, stepped aside to let her pass. Her voice cracked as she said, barely above a whisper, that the pilots still weren't responding. The young girl felt her stomach twist painfully. She tried not to imagine what it would feel like if she failed, what it would mean for everyone on board. She told herself not to think about that. Not now. There was no room for panic. Panic would cost lives. When she finally reached the cockpit door, she hesitated for a moment. Her hand hovered over the handle, trembling uncontrollably. She had dreamed of seeing the inside of a cockpit since she was a child, but not like this, not with alarms blaring, not with unconscious pilots, not with a plane falling from the sky. She swallowed hard and pushed the door open. The moment she stepped inside, a cold wave of dread swept over her. The air in the cockpit felt heavier, filled with the sharp scent of overheated electronics and warning signals. Red lights flashed across the panels. The screens were filled with alerts: engine failure, altitude drop, stall warnings, system errors. Both pilots were slumped forward, their heads resting against the controls, unconscious but breathing. They looked peaceful in the most terrifying way possible, completely unaware of the chaos around them. She squeezed past the captain's seat, her hands brushing the cold metal of the equipment. Her fingers tingled with fear, but she forced herself to sit down. The seat felt enormous compared to her small frame, and the controls looked more intimidating than any simulator she had ever used. But she didn't allow herself to freeze. She reminded herself that she had practiced this, at least in some form. She closed her eyes for a brief second, inhaling deeply, grounding herself in the belief that she could do this. Her hands hovered over the yoke, shaking but determined. She gently pulled back, trying to stabilize the nose of the aircraft. The jet responded slowly, almost stubbornly, as if questioning her authority. She gritted her teeth and tried again, focusing on the horizon through the cockpit windshield. It was tilted dangerously downward, giving her a horrifying view of the distant ground rushing closer. The plane continued to rumble violently, but the angle of descent softened slightly. It wasn't stable yet, not even close, but it was enough to keep them from plummeting. The young girl reached for the radio system, her fingers struggling to press the correct buttons amid her shaking. She cleared her throat, trying to steady her voice, but when she spoke, her words trembled with raw fear. She explained the emergency situation to air traffic control, her voice cracking as she admitted the pilots were unconscious and she was trying to take control. There was a pause on the other end, a shocked silence that felt endless, before a calm, steady voice responded. The controller asked her to stay calm. He told her they were going to help her step by step. She nodded instinctively, even though they couldn't see her. The guidance from the tower became her lifeline, a steady thread of hope in a sky filled with chaos. She followed their instructions with as much precision as her shaking hands allowed. She adjusted the throttle, checked the altitude readings, scanned the instrument panels for anything critical. She recognized some controls from her simulator experience, but many were unfamiliar, overwhelming, and frighteningly real. She forced herself not to panic and instead focus on what she knew. The plane dipped suddenly, and her heart leapt into her throat. She yanked the yoke back harder, her small arms straining against the heavy resistance. The aircraft leveled only slightly, enough to stop the terrifying drop but not enough to stabilize. Sweat formed on her forehead, her hair sticking to her skin as she fought to keep the jet balanced. Every small mistake could send them spiraling out of control. The alarms continued screaming relentlessly, their shrill beeps mixing with the roaring wind outside. Behind her, flight attendants stood silently near the cockpit doorway, watching her with a mixture of awe and terror. Some passengers had unbuckled just enough to peek down the aisle, trying to catch glimpses of the unknown hero fighting to save them. The cabin was filled with whispered prayers, suppressed sobs, and the quiet rumble of people trying to remain hopeful. The young girl's muscles burned, her eyes stung from tears she refused to let fall, and her throat felt tight with emotion. But she pushed through it all. Her mind replayed hours of simulator lessons: how to maintain altitude, how to correct pitch, how to align with a runway. She remembered watching real pilots on YouTube explaining emergency procedures. She remembered reading aviation forums where people discussed what to do if a pilot became incapacitated. At the time, they all seemed like fun facts. Now they were the difference between life and death. She listened closely to the controller's instructions, repeating them softly under her breath to make sure she didn't forget a single detail. The plane continued descending, but now in a controlled glide rather than a catastrophic fall. The tower helped her calculate the distance to the nearest airport. They told her how to adjust her direction, how to correct her altitude, how to prepare for an emergency landing. She followed every word with determination that surprised even herself. Her breathing was uneven, shallow, almost gasping at times, but she forced herself to stay focused. She wiped her palms on her pants to remove the sweat and steadied her grip on the controls. The view through the windshield slowly shifted from uncontrolled chaos to something she could manage. The airport runway was still far away, barely visible through the haze of clouds and engine smoke, but she could see it. A small strip of hope waiting for her. She whispered to herself again and again that she could do this. That she had to do this. That she was the only one here who could even try. The plane shook again violently as it hit another pocket of turbulence, and she nearly lost control. Her breath caught in her chest, but she tightened her grip and pulled the nose back up. Her arms trembled with the effort. Her mind screamed at her to stay calm. The ground was closer now. Too close. But the tower kept guiding her. The passengers kept silently praying. And she kept fighting. Every second felt like an hour. Every adjustment felt like a battle. Every breath felt like a test of courage she didn't know she possessed. But she did not stop. Because stopping meant giving up. Stopping meant losing 186 lives that were depending on her. Stopping meant letting fear win. And she refused to let that happen. She kept going, driven by a courage far bigger than her age. She wasn't just trying to control a jet anymore. She was holding on to hope, holding on to life, holding on to the belief that even in the darkest moment imaginable, someone like her, a young girl with trembling hands and a heart full of determination, could still rise up and try to do the impossible. She tightened her hands on the controls, locked her eyes on the distant runway, and prepared herself for the hardest part yet. The alarms were screaming, the aircraft was shaking, and the runway was still impossibly far away. The young girl felt the vibrations travel up through the metal frame of the cockpit seat into her body, rattling her bones and echoing inside her chest. The warning lights flashed in desperate bursts of red and orange, each one begging for attention, each one signaling danger she didn't have time to fully understand. But she kept her eyes forward, her trembling hands gripping the controls as she fought against the chaos surrounding her. The jet felt alive, as if it had its own heartbeat, pounding violently through the yoke in her hands. She could feel the weight of the massive aircraft resisting her, burdened by the failed engine, the turbulence, and the rapid descent. The wind outside roared like a storm tearing across the sky, making the windows shudder in their frames. Every time the plane dipped or jolted, the passengers let out gasps and cries that echoed faintly through the cockpit door behind her. Her breath came in shallow bursts, and she tried to steady it. She forced herself to remember the emergency instructions being recited through her headset. The calm voice of the air traffic controller was her lifeline, guiding her step by step through a disaster no child should ever face. She listened intently, repeating each direction under her breath to keep herself focused. She adjusted the throttle gently, careful not to overcorrect. The jet shuddered in response, as if complaining, but the descent slowed slightly. She pulled back on the yoke just enough to lift the nose. The horizon straightened by a small but crucial degree. She could finally see the glimmer of a runway far ahead, a narrow, distant strip of hope in a sky full of danger. Her heart thudded painfully as she tried to align the plane with that single target. Every correction felt like a battle. One wrong move could send the jet into a deadly spiral. But she remembered the hours she had spent practicing landings on her simulator, teaching herself the rhythm of adjustments, the patience required to balance altitude and direction. Now, those lessons were the only tools she had. The passengers behind her held their breath with every motion she made. Their hearts rose and fell with the movement of the plane. Flight attendants clung to seatbacks, silently praying while watching the young girl do the impossible. Some passengers whispered encouragement to a girl they couldn't even see but believed in with all their remaining hope. The jet lurched again, and she felt her stomach twist as the nose dipped sharply. Alarms blared louder, mixing with the rattling of loose compartments overhead. Her hands slipped slightly on the controls from sweat, and she wiped them against her clothes quickly before gripping the yoke again. She forced herself not to panic, even as the aircraft trembled violently. The tower's voice guided her to correct the angle. She followed every instruction with desperate focus. She adjusted the flaps, slowed the descent, and corrected the tilt. The runway grew clearer, bigger, closer, but still far enough that 1,000 things could go wrong before they reached it. She kept reminding herself that she could do this. She whispered it like a mantra, a fragile shield against the immense fear pressing down on her. She could feel tears burning in her eyes, but she blinked them away. There was no time for crying. Not when lives depended on her. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the aircraft's wounded engine side, tipping the jet dangerously. She gasped as the horizon tilted sharply, the plane jerking sideways. The passengers screamed. Every alarm erupted again, warning of loss of lateral stability. Her heart raced, but she tightened her grip and counter-steered, pushing against the imbalance with every ounce of strength in her body. The plane resisted at first, wobbling violently, but slowly, agonizingly, it responded. She straightened the wings, breathing hard as the cabin behind her slowly quieted. People clung to armrests, hands shaking, tears streaming down their faces. They didn't know her name. They didn't know how old she was. They only knew that this girl, this unexpected, unlikely hero, was fighting for them with everything she had. The controller's voice continued guiding her, calm and steady despite the chaos. He told her to check her altitude and decrease speed as they prepared for final approach. She nodded even though he couldn't see her. She reached forward to adjust the settings, her fingers trembling so much she nearly missed the switch. She took a deep breath and tried again, this time steadying her hand long enough to complete the action. The plane jolted once more as the speed decreased, but it held. She felt the aircraft start to glide rather than fall. The difference was subtle but important, she was bringing it under control bit by bit. The runway grew closer. She could now see the lights bordering it, glowing faintly through the haze of smoke drifting from the damaged engine. She swallowed hard. This was the moment she had practiced countless times in simulations. But this was no game. This time, failure meant lives lost. This time, the pressure wasn't virtual, it was real, overwhelming, and terrifying. She focused on the alignment. The plane was slightly off course, drifting to the right. She adjusted gently, remembering all too well that sudden movements could destabilize them. The plane responded sluggishly but began to shift toward the center line. She exhaled shakily, relief mixing with fear. She was doing it. She was actually doing it. Behind her, every passenger sat frozen, hardly daring to breathe. Some held hands tightly, others closed their eyes. A few watched through the windows as the ground came steadily closer. Every heartbeat felt like a countdown. A new alarm suddenly pierced the cockpit, ground proximity warning. The voice in the headset reminded her to stay calm, to hold the glide, to maintain control. She nodded again, her voice barely a whisper as she answered. She could feel the weight of the aircraft pulling downward, gravity trying to take control, but she fought back, lifting the nose slightly. The runway lights were shining brighter now. The tower cleared her for emergency landing. Her heart hammered harder. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand and tightened her grip, her fingers numb from tension. The plane shook violently as another gust of wind hit them, but she held the line. She kept the aircraft steady, knowing that everyone's fate depended on these final adjustments. Her breath came in short bursts as she lowered the landing gear, hearing the mechanical whir beneath the jet. The wheels locked into position with a loud, reassuring thunk. She was officially committed to the landing now. She checked the speed. Still too high. She pulled back slightly on the throttle, feeling the engine strain and the jet slow down just enough. Not too much. Not too fast. Carefully. Precisely. Just like she practiced, only this time, with 186 people counting on her. The plane descended lower, the runway stretching out beneath them like a thin strip of salvation. Her arms ached. Her shoulders were stiff. Her eyes didn't blink. She couldn't afford to blink. The cabin behind her fell into complete silence. Every single person waited. Every single heart held still. Every single breath was suspended in the air. The young girl whispered to herself, reminding her shaking body to stay steady. She aligned the wheels with the runway lines, her entire world narrowing to that single moment, that single landing, that single chance to save everyone. She could feel how close they were. She could sense the airplane sinking toward the ground. She heard the roar of air rushing past the fuselage grow louder, deeper, more urgent. The voice from the tower guided her through the last steps, but it felt like everything around her faded away. There was only her, the jet, the runway, and the thin thread of hope pulling them forward. Her hands tightened. Her breath held. Her heart thundered. The wheels were seconds from touching down. And 186 lives waited for the miracle she was fighting to deliver. With one final move, she lowered the landing gear and brought the jet down, her hands trembling yet steady with determination. The landing gear unfolded beneath them with a mechanical groan, the sound echoing through the aircraft like a promise that the impossible might actually happen. The runway stretched ahead like a lifeline, illuminated by rows of glowing lights that cut through the haze and smoke swirling in the air. The young girl swallowed hard, tightening her grip on the controls as she prepared for the moment that would decide everything. The plane descended rapidly, the nose dipping just enough to align with the runway's edge. The passengers behind her felt the shift in gravity, they clutched their armrests, held their breath, and closed their eyes, each one silently praying for a miracle. The flight attendants stood braced against the cockpit wall, watching the girl with a mixture of awe and terror, knowing they were witnessing something no one would ever believe unless they had seen it with their own eyes. The ground rushed closer. The runway lights shimmered. The air pressure shifted. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She whispered to herself to steady her breathing. She remembered everything she had practiced on her flight simulator: the flare, the timing, the balance of throttle and pitch. She couldn't afford even the slightest mistake. Not now. Not when 186 souls were depending on her. The wheels touched down with a massive jolt, hard, louder than she expected. The impact shot through her entire body, rattling her teeth, shaking the cockpit violently. The screech of rubber against asphalt echoed through the plane. But she had done it. They were no longer falling. They were on the ground. Yet the danger wasn't over. The jet bounced once from the force of the landing, lifting slightly off the runway again. The girl gasped and pulled the yoke back gently, fighting to keep the nose aligned. The second contact was even harder. Sparks erupted beneath the aircraft, bright streaks of orange and yellow that illuminated the dusk sky. The passengers screamed as the metal beneath them screeched and skidded across the runway. She held on with every ounce of strength she had, her arms burning, her fingers locking into place around the controls. The aircraft swerved violently to the left, and she countersteered with all the focus she could muster. The left engine dragged against the runway, shooting another shower of sparks into the air. The smell of burning rubber filled the cabin. The plane's speed was still dangerously high. If it didn't slow down soon, it would overshoot the runway and crash. She slammed her feet onto the brake pedals, feeling the aircraft shudder violently in response. The plane groaned, metal straining against the pressure. She heard something crack beneath them, but she refused to panic. Her arms shook uncontrollably, but she held the line, guiding the jet as it skidded and scraped across the asphalt. Seconds felt like minutes. The world outside blurred into rushing streaks of gray and white. The runway lights reflected off the scratched windows. The alarms, though still loud, grew dimmer beneath the overwhelming roar of the brakes fighting against the forward momentum. The plane slowed. Gradually. Painfully. Inch by inch. She felt the weight of the jet shifting beneath her, the speed dropping with every breath she took. The violent shaking began to ease. The screeching grew softer. The sparks diminished. The cabin grew quieter, except for the sound of passengers crying, praying, or whispering desperately to their loved ones. The plane rolled forward, slower and slower, until, at last, it came to a complete stop. Silence fell inside the aircraft. Real silence. For a moment, the girl didn't breathe. She didn't blink. She didn't move. Her body stayed frozen in place, her hands still gripping the controls even though the jet was no longer moving. Her mind couldn't quite understand what had happened. She had done it. She had actually done it. They were alive. Then the world around her erupted. Behind her, a loud chorus of sobs, gasps, and relieved cries filled the cabin. People unbuckled their seatbelts with trembling hands and hugged each other, some sinking to their knees in gratitude, others pressing their faces into their hands as they cried from relief. Mothers held their children tightly. Elderly passengers wiped tears from their wrinkled cheeks. Couples clung to one another as if they had been given a second chance at life. The flight attendants rushed forward, flooding the cockpit with emotional voices, thanking her over and over again, their eyes wet with tears. One of them reached out and gently took her hands off the controls, realizing she was still holding on as if she were afraid the plane might suddenly take off again. Her small hands were shaking violently, her knuckles pale from gripping too tightly. The flight attendant wrapped her arms around the girl in a tight, trembling hug. She whispered that she had saved them. That she had done what even grown adults might not have had the courage to attempt. That she was a miracle in human form. But the young girl didn't feel like a hero. Not yet. She felt overwhelmed, drained, and utterly exhausted. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, and tears she had been holding back since the start of the emergency finally spilled from her eyes. She let out a choked sob, the fear she had been suppressing crashing over her like a wave. The pilots were quickly removed from their seats by emergency responders who rushed into the cockpit moments later. They were still unconscious but breathing. Paramedics checked the girl as well, gently lifting her chin and shining a small light in her eyes to make sure she hadn't fainted from shock. She blinked at the brightness but managed a weak nod when they asked if she could hear them. The aircraft's doors opened, and rescue teams flooded inside, guiding passengers down the inflatable slides. People cried tears of joy as their feet touched solid ground again. Some of them pointed back at the cockpit, telling paramedics and reporters that a young girl had saved them. Nobody believed it at first. How could a child land a commercial jet? But then they saw her. A small, exhausted figure seated in the captain's chair, cheeks streaked with tears, hair messy, hands trembling, eyes wide with shock. And yet, there was something unmistakably brave in the way she sat there. Something undeniably heroic. As she stepped out of the cockpit, the passengers who had been waiting on the ground erupted into applause. The sound was overwhelming, louder than the plane's alarms had ever been. People rushed to her, bowing their heads, thanking her, some dropping to their knees in gratitude. She felt dizzy from all the attention, unsure how to react. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight. She wasn't used to being called a hero. But that day, she truly was one. Her story spread across the airport like wildfire. Reporters gathered, trying to catch a glimpse of the brave girl who had saved 186 lives. Emergency responders talked about her with disbelief, saying they had never seen anything like it. Pilots shook their heads in amazement, unable to comprehend how a child had done what many trained professionals might have struggled with. She didn't brag. She didn't boast. She didn't even fully understand the magnitude of what she had done. All she could think about was how terrified she had been, how much she had wanted to cry, how desperately she had wished for someone else to take control. But when no one else could, she had stepped forward. She had taken the controls. She had faced the impossible. And she had won. Hours later, as the sun began to set, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink, she finally sat alone on a bench near the airport terminal. Her body still trembled. Her hands were still shaking. She felt tired in a way she had never felt before. But deep inside her chest, beneath the exhaustion and the fear, there was a glow, warm, quiet, and strong. She had discovered courage she never knew she had. Courage that had saved lives. Courage that had changed everything. Strangers continued to approach her, offering flowers, hugging her gently, thanking her again and again. Some called her an angel. Others said she had been sent by fate. But she knew the truth. She wasn't an angel. She was just a girl who tried her best in the scariest moment of her life. And sometimes, trying your best is what makes you a hero. All 186 passengers survived that day. Families were reunited. Children were held tighter. Tears were shed not from fear, but from gratitude. And in the middle of it all stood a young girl whose bravery had rewritten their destinies. She had stepped forward with fear in her eyes but courage in her heart. And because of her, 186 people walked away from what could have been a tragedy. That day, she didn't just land a plane.